Hello, everyone. Today we'll be talking about Buddhism. So let us begin. So this is a great book, was published in 2020 by Nicolas Bomarito, and he has a very nice way of introducing us to Buddhism. Other books that trying to introduce Buddhism, and there's a lot of them, typically begin by pointing to like the heart of the doctrines, things like the Four Noble Truths, the No Self doctrine, the nature of enlightenment, rebirth, and things like that, karma. And all of that's great, all of that's an important part of Buddhism, but it creates the sense of isolation or alienation by readers from, say, the West that are not familiar with those ideas. It's hard to enter into this weird world, this strange world, to make sense of the Buddhist, what the Buddhists are up to. One of the great benefits of this book, however, is that he does a very good job of kind of easing you into some of these doctrines in a great way. So let us walk through it. So in the preface, here's how he presents Buddhism. So here's what he says. Buddhism is about you, about your life, and how to get through it. It's about the problems you face and where they come from. The fundamental source of these problems, Buddhists say, is that the world is very different from how ordinary experience of it seems. So Buddhism is about you and your life and how to get through your life. Presented that way, it's attractive to everyone. Although those of us who are alive should have, pay some attention to Buddhism. It's a good way of like getting you to think about what the Buddhists are doing. And furthermore, he points out to the fundamental source of the problems that we have, and we'll get to those shortly, is a misalignment between our expectations, the way we look at the world, and the way the world actually is. So suffering at the end of the day is the misalignment. Our expectations, our outlook, in the way the world is don't match, and that creates frustration, that creates depression, that creates anxiety, that creates the psychological problems that the Buddhist is trying to solve. So you fix this problem by changing your outlook. Given that you cannot change the way the world is, you change your outlook, and then once it matches the way that things really are, you attain this better state of tranquility, peace, and sense of unity with it all. I mean, that's it. Like, that's the heart of Buddhism presented very neatly and in a way that is kind of not embedded in all of these claims that seem pretty strange to the Western mind. So Matt also points out that there are multiple different strands of Buddhism, and he's not here to defend one as the better one, though he does say clearly that he thinks that the kind of secularized one, the one that emphasizes the psychological elements of Buddhism, is the one that he aligns with. He's a little kind of skeptical about the more kind of supernatural claims within Buddhism, but he's going to present them both as he goes. So there's the problem. Let's try to figure out what that is. Here's a kind of presentation of the way the world is, the way society, social reality happens. Happens to us, how we perceive it. So we spend much of our time doing things unreflectively and merely complying with social expectations. You get up in the morning, you brush your teeth, you take a shower, go to the gym, go to work, you go to school. There are all of these kind of expectations and assumptions about what is good for you to do with your life, and you comply with them, right? You keep going through it. The Buddhist insists that most of those, or perhaps all of those socially constructed stories that we tell ourselves about what is valuable. So our candidate, a political candidate, wins office and we're very excited. Or our team, the team that we root for, the soccer team, loses and we're very sad, right? Like in our society tells us, root for this, rejoice in that, be upset about that. And we just comply with it. We just see the world through all of these social expectations unreflectively. That's how we operate in the world. However, it breaks. That facade cannot be sustained. Why not? Because your aunt dies, you get ill, your grandparents get very old and frail. There are some elements of reality that don't match that typical kind of story that we tell ourselves, a socially constructed reality. It breaks through it. There are some bad things in the world that we act as though they're not there. And then this kind of scream comes to us, like, oh, like the whole thing might collapse. The whole edifice, socially constructed edifice, might collapse because it all presupposes things like there's no death and suffering, but there is. It's everywhere. And furthermore, so pain has this way of breaking through the facade. But even in good times, things are not as neat. So this is true. There's a problem, even in good times too, but it's easier to ignore. The problem is easy to ignore. When you achieve a goal or have some good luck, something good happens to you, you feel good, you celebrate, rejoice. But there's always this slight buzz, this kind of beneath of this celebration, that there's a kind of anxiety that the success will not last, that is fleeting, that would not endure. So you want to go on a date, you want to enter this program, you want to join this team, you want to get this promotion, you strive for it and you get it. And even when you get this thing you want, there's this level of anxiety that is not as satisfying as you thought it would be, that you're not as happy with it, because part of your assumption, part of your expectation was to have that good and for that good to endure, for that good to last. You wanted to hold that good for eternity, or for at least a lot longer than it were actually going to be there. And that's an essential part of the misalignment. You want things to last longer than they do. And when they don't, it hurts. That's frustration, that's suffering. So Buddhism is about seeing that, recognizing the mismatch. So Buddhism is about taking a long, hard look at the way things really are, not just pretending that they're not. When we do this, some of what we find is harsh. People get sick, people die, people cheat, people steal, people lie. We look after our own. And that's also a bad thing. We only look after our own. We treat people outside of our groups, religious, cultures, races, as though they're inferior, as though they don't count. And we're very willing to, at least a lot of us, are very willing to undermine or oppress or attack the well-being of those for the sake of our group. That's part of the viciousness of the world. Furthermore, things that are put together will eventually come apart. Books, edifices, stories, careers, loves, everything that is valuable is put together with care, with dedication, but it's all destined to fall apart. Everything falls apart. Second law of thermodynamics, everything breaks. So what happens when we realize everything breaks and the story we tell ourselves then do not align for that? Well, you can try to hide it, you can try to pretend it's not there, but that's not the Buddhist way. Rather than pretending things aren't the way they are, or wishing and hoping that things will be different, uh, that's not going to work. Buddhist offers a way to live at ease and full view of such facts. The Buddhist point is to live in such a way that you're fully aware of the fact that there's pain, there's suffering, there's aging, there's death. And that when you get something that is valuable, it will cease to be within a relatively short period of time. Relate to the world with the full recognition of its frailty, with the full recognition of its transience. Things will pass, things will cease to be, everything will break. And that's the way the world is. And our perspective should be in alignment. And to the extent that it's in alignment with that, frustration, misery, and so on will cease to be, or at least will take lesser hold on us. The basic insight of Buddhism is that the source of this fundamental problem, the problem of suffering, is a mismatch between our most basic feelings and the way the world is. And certain assumptions are things like we want things to endure. We want the goods that we enjoy to stay there forever, and they don't. So when they don't, when people die, when people get ill, that's when that's when the serious psychological disturbances happen. And that's when our reality is kind of broken. There's a way of solving it. There's a solution. The Buddhist thinks that that's the way the world is, but suffering can be dealt with. So the fundamental problem, our deep anxiety, insecurity comes from a mismatch. The way we relate to the world is not in alignment with it. That's the problem. How do we solve it? Well, we realign it. We reorient the way we see the world. We change our expectations to match the way the world is. That involves two elements. One is the philosophical element, which is the process of thinking carefully, trying to identify what really is there with no delusion. And that's crucial. But the Buddhist thinks that's not enough. You must also engage in all sorts of practices, so like meditation and mindfulness. Do those practices change the habituation of the mind to now see the way the world is? We grew up in this facade, this way of looking at the world that tried to pretend like there was no problems, that there was no evil, suffering, and death. And we were gradually habituated to looking at the world that way. That's why we suffer. And now we must gradually habituate ourselves to looking at the world the way that it is. And when we do, we're enlightened. Enlightened. We see the way the world is, and we can live in peace with that full recognition. And the Buddha is kind of the exemplar of this. The Buddha is not like Christ in the Christian tradition. Christ is the second person of the Trinity, so he's God. The Buddha is no divine being. He's a person like you and I. The only difference is that he did manage to fix the problem. He managed to see the world the way the world is, and to feel in the right response, right? Not to be overly attached to things because they will cease to be, not to be overly angry with things that happen because also they cease to be, right? So it had this peace of mind and tranquility, and his alignment with the way the world is. He attained the state of alignment. So in Buddhism, everyone can become a Buddha. In fact, the goal of being a Buddhist is to become a Buddha. To be a Buddha just is to attain this state of alignment. So it's different than the Christ story. The first historical Buddha was Siddhartha Gautama. He was born roughly 500 years before Christ, before Common Era in Nepal. And he was depicted, there was this prediction or prophecy that he was either going to be a great king or a great spiritual leader. And he was the son of a king. So the father wanted him to be a great king. And in order to bring that part of the prophecy about, the father protected Gautama from all of the external pains and sufferings, tried to create this fabricated reality within the palace that was devoid of suffering, of pain, of illness, and death. And the point was to make the Gautama enjoy that so much that he wanted to be a king. But it didn't work out. Gautama went out into the world and he saw someone being old, the frailty of old age, just someone very ill, the despair of illness, and then a corpse, death. And seeing old age, illness, and death kind of shook him existentially. And the story paints it as being the first time in which he saw those things. But the main point is something like, it is very different when you live in this palace, when you act as though, pretend as though, navigate the world as though old age, illness, and death are not going to touch you. They exist in some sense, but beyond the walls of the palace, they're not going to touch you. And that's false. They will touch you. Death won't get you anywhere. So the main point of the Buddha story of exiting the palace is this psychological, existential recognition that can only be had when you actually think about your own death, when your mom dies, when someone close to you, someone who's you think are within the walls of your palace, when death enters there, when illness enters there, when that's when you realize, oh, I cannot keep living in the palace. The life in the palace is false. And the life in the palace is a metaphor for telling ourselves stories that are devoid of, that pretend to, that hide the facts of the bad facts of life from us. So the story of the Buddha is a story that kind of encapsulates what happens to us all. So the Buddha leaves the palace, and after years of discipline, he attains enlightenment. And this happened, and then here's the story. He sits under this tree, and he in the lotus position as depicted here, and he commits to not getting up until he sees the way the world is. He attains enlightenment. In part of the story is that there's this demon-like character that tempts him, that sends his daughters, which are desire and this and aversion. And the daughters are demon-like characters that are trying to tempt him. And then he endures through the temptations, and then he sees through the temptations, and they disappear, and he finally sees himself in union with everything in his surroundings. And that's the state of enlightenment. He's to see his interconnectedness with the whole, and the fact that everything is transient, the fact that everything ceases to be, that nothing's permanent. That's the state of enlightenment. And out of this story, two different kind of Buddhist traditions come to the fore. There is one which is that supernatural tradition that insists that for this story to be kind of the foundation of Buddhism, there has to be this demon-like character that actually existed, that actually sent daughters that were actually there, and that were demon-likes, right? So this interpretation of Buddhism has it that these supernatural elements better be there, lest Buddhism be false. The second element is the more kind of secular element, which the author likes, which is also main element within Buddhism. And the thought is that the perception of the demons was just part of the deception, was part of the assumptions inculcated by the previous religious upbringing of the Buddha. And then when the woman, the demons disappeared, was this point of enlightenment, partly because he realized that he is what was happening where this is psychological kind of struggles from within. So this identification of himself with the totality of things is part of the enlightenment. this recognition that what appeared to be a demonic temptation was a psychological kind of tendency within him, a struggle for him to overcome his own kind of psychological inclinations and his own identification with it all. So this kind of secularization or psychologization of the story is seen by the second strand as crucial to the enlightenment of the Buddha. So it's a kind of way of distancing from those supernatural elements. And this second strand thinks is essential to what the story is supposed to say. In any case, here's what like the story paints. So the Buddha takes the basic structure of like medicine, like diagnosis, prognosis, and remedy, and broadens the scope of that practice to apply to all of suffering. So here is the diagnosis. We want security, health, peace, and happiness, and crucially, we want them to last. We don't just want to be secure in health and at peace for 20 minutes. No, we want to endure being in that state. That's the perspective, that's the desire, that's what we want. But the world doesn't collaborate. The world does not ensure that. In fact, ensures the opposite. Cycle of thermodynamics, everything breaks. We cannot be in a perpetual state of security, health, and peace. Like that's not going to happen. So that's where frustration and suffering comes about, when we so cling to these goods that when they're taken away, we despair. So the greatest pain of suffering is the great hope of having those, happiness that will last, and then it doesn't last. That is the heart of the problem. In the cause, as I'm saying, is that the we misrepresent what is there. We want the happiness to endure, but the world does not allow for that. So the solution is that we change our perspective, and things like the misery and the frustration and the loneliness that we have, which are the result of the misline, those will cease to be. And they will cease to be precisely because they came about of our expectations and the way the world is not. So Buddhism is, at the end of the day, an optimistic view. It says that despite the pervasiveness of old age, illness, and death, suffering itself is not inevitable. Those things may be suffering. Old age and death may be inevitable. Suffering is not. You can have a happy life, a peaceful life, but it's one that requires recognition of those things. And the problem is solvable. But the Buddhist thinks you cannot just think about it and then it comes into being. It takes a lifelong commitment to habituating your mind to see what is there and to be at peace with it, to not overly cling to it. So here are the final reflections about mindfulness of death. From the Buddhist perspective, living with full recognition of death, of the inevitability of death, is essential to not create the wrong kinds of expectations that it end up ultimately being the greatest source of suffering. So here's a picture of a small girl in Mexico in the Day of the Dead. And part of the Day of the Dead is to kind of celebrate the people that have passed away. But it's also this way of bringing to mind the reality of death. We will all die. That's why the face is painted, and half the face is painted as a skull. The thought is, death is within me. It is inevitable. It will come. I must enjoy each of my days with a full recognition of the end outside. So that's the impermanence of things. Nothing will remain forever. Everything will cease to be. Second law of thermodynamics. So impermanence can be easy to accept as an intellectual abstract idea, but the death makes it personal and tangible. So you might think this idea that all things seems to be, yeah, that's fine. But it's when we, like the Buddha in the story, actually see someone die, that hits us. Oh, like this is not just some idea outside of the palace of our perception, but it's part of the real world, and it's inevitable. So one day, each of us will stop breathing and be separated from everyone and everything that we care about. As composite beings, our bodies will turn cold and decompose. Saying those things, think those things might seem more bold and gray and bad, but the Buddhist one says the reason why you think it seems more bold and bad and like there's something despicable here is precisely because you like to pretend it's not there. If you were in tune with the world, when you would realize these observations about your own death, you wouldn't despair and think like something's wrong because it's true. So the fact that you think I shouldn't be saying this is an indication that no, you should, because you're lying to yourself, pretending that that's not there. So in this context, you reflect on difficult things like death in order to get a better deal, to better deal with them. The point of coming to full recognition that you will die and thinking about it, like contemplating your death, how people that you love you will respond to that, and so on. is not to be morose, but to realize that it will happen and to live your world, your life with full recognition of that, to appreciate the things you have, like the people that you love, the accomplishments that you have, with the full recognition that they will cease to be, is a way of being at peace with it. So this reflection on death, the Buddhists insist, would would place things in perspective, things like fights, rivalries, successes, failures, and so on. We tend to be overly kind of vengeful when someone hurts us, partly because we thought that the thing that they're hurting was permanent, and we ascribe this level of permanency to the hurt that they inflict upon us. But it won't, right? Like we're fabricating it, we're constructing it. And likewise for our successes, we feel kind of despairing after getting the success because we expected that success to be a lot greater than it was. We should see reality as it is, and that would help us cope with the failures, and it will help us appreciate, to the extent that they can be appreciated, the successes that we have, or put them into perspective, and not diluting into thinking that they are and whether not. So remember death is the Buddhist mantra. Why? Because it enables you to see things as they really are. And once you see things as they really are, with recognition of death as inevitable, you'll come to have this kind of more detached appreciation for what is there, which is accurate, which sees the way the world is. Okay, let's stop there.